So, hi everyone, this is Vedangi Singh. I am a mental and emotional well-being therapist, and I have been a therapist for the past 4 years. And I've also been an ex-UPSC aspirant. I have given six attempts, and I've written two mains as well. Unfortunately, I couldn't move ahead. Apart from that, I have done my master's in psychology. I am trained as a cognitive hypnotic psychotherapist, and I've also cleared GATE exam in psychology with All India rank 26. So that is more about me. And now let's come back to the topic that we are going to deal today, the fear of failure. So I would first request as many of you can possibly put your cameras on, please do so. If you need a few minutes, you can take your time and put the cameras on. But I would request, to more and more people, whoever can, please keep your cameras on because I do not want to be speaking to a wall, right? Okay, so I would like to quickly know from you guys, how in your life do you think this fear of failure manifests, and what is the effect that you are what is your experience with fear of failure, and from there we can move ahead quickly. One or two people who would like to share about their experiences with fear of failure. You can unmute yourself or you can type in the chat box. Happy Navratri, Sushant. Thank you so much. Does anybody have anything to share? So I'll wait for a couple of minutes in case anybody wants to type out. No? Okay. Okay, fear of not getting selected in the exam despite of doing the hard work. Okay. And how, what is it? What is this fear? How is this fear affecting you right now? So while we do have this fear, what will happen if we do not clear the exam? But how is this fear affecting your life right now? That's what I want to know. It affects daily productivity. Okay. Anushri is saying that it affects her daily productivity. What about others? You can unmute yourself as well if you want. It affects productivity and confidence. Okay. All right. So let's look at fear of failure. Okay. Now, as the word, it affects daily cycle of life and we get into trap cycle. Yes, it does happen. Okay. So coming back to fear of failure. So as the word, is self-explanatory, that we kind of start to have that intense fear of of failing, and we start anticipating failure, and that's what causes that fear. What if I actually end up failing, right? So in terms of fear of failure, there are two aspects, right? First is the fear itself, which is the emotion, and then there is an expectation of failure, which is the cognitive or the thought part, right? If we are not expecting to fail, fear of failure would not even come in the come in the picture, right? So there are two parts to fear of failure. First is the emotion, which is the fear itself, and the second is the expectation of failure, that I'm expecting that I might end up failing, right? So now that we know that, okay, fear of failure is actually going to is comprising of the emotional component as well as the thought component. So whenever in order to overcome fear of failure, we need to look at both the aspects, the emotional aspect as well as the aspect where we are considering the thought, what if I fail, or I think I'm I cannot do this, right? Whatever that thought is. For some people, it could figure out as, I don't think I am capable enough to clear it. So for some of you, it might think of what will happen if I actually fail. So the thought can be different, but then there's always that expectation or the or the assumption that I'm soon going to fail, right? And this fear of failure makes us avoid certain activities or certain situations that have the potential to end in an unsuccessful attempt or an unsuccessful outcome, right? And sorry. And why is it a problem? It becomes a problem because we become risk averse, right? So if we have a fear of failure, we'll try to avoid the things which will which we actually potentially feel ki, doing engaging in this particular scenario or engaging in this particular activity will lead us to a failure. So let me not even engage myself there, right? So we would all have heard about that story where a fox was going in a garden. That fox saw a vineyard. It saw the grapes hanging there, but the grapes were too high. So the fox told him, ki, those grapes are not meant for me. No, those grapes are too sour. They are not meant for me. So because I expect a failure, that I will even if I take a jump, I'll not be able to grab the grapes. So I'm telling myself it's better that I don't even attempt it, right? So here the that fox has kind of rationalized his fear, but again what was operating behind that rationalization was still that fear of failure. The fox kind of believe that I'll not be able to grab those grapes, so I'm telling myself that those grapes are sour, I'll not even attempt it. So we become more risk averse, and if you're becoming risk averse, it can actually it can so I'll come to how it manifests, but before that, uh, so there's one thing that so there's one very paradoxical thing that happens, that even though most people fail in their lives, somebody has written down something. Let me just read the comments 1 second. Okay. Paralysis of activity does happen. That is right. Not to do is better than do, and fail yeah. Okay. So yeah. So one very paradoxical thing that happens is that while most people fail in their lives at one point or the other, right? There would hardly be anyone who would not have failed at anything in their lives, right? But even though that even though that this is true, that most of us fail at some point of our lives, or no, we do fail at some point of our life, still there are some people who would who would go about their life not really feeling so feeling so concerned about the failure. But then there would be certain other people who would genuinely have this fear of failure, right? So why does it happen that there are some people who so why does this happen that some people fear failure while others don't, right? If failure was in itself something very scary and something something very threatening, everyone should be feeling fearful of failing, right? So if it was jumping into a well is something which is actually threatening. So no, everybody would if we were told to jump into a well, all of us would feel fear, irrespective of who we are. But if failure was similarly as threatening, everyone should feel the fear of failing, but not everyone does. Then why is that? Why is that some people fear failure while others don't? The reason is that people who internalize their failure, they start viewing the outcome of their efforts as the reflection of their self-worth. Isn't it? If we equate our success or failure with how worthy or how valuable we are, then it would really matter to us if we are failing or being successful, isn't it? If my whole self worth is based on the idea whether I'm being successful in XYZ thing or not, then there's a highly likely chance that I'll actually be fearful of failing, because if I do not succeed, it threatens myself, right? So we need to realize that failure in itself is not as bad as internalizing that failure is. So if you say, so when we say that failure is equals to I'm unworthy, then it becomes, then it manifests as fear of failure. Oh, I've written future, sorry. But if I'm saying that failure is just another experience, then I don't have any fear of failure. There would be many people who would be giving UPSC. They would be at a very, emotionally they would be in a very balanced kind of a state. Like even if they're not able to clear the exam, their whole self-worth and their whole life does not revolve around this thing. Even if they're not able to clear the exam, they'll move on to the next thing. Probably they'll try for 2 or 3 years and then they'll move on to the next thing. Does that mean they were not they were not uh, hardworking enough, or were they trying to they were not serious enough or something? Probably no. Probably they were more serious than most of us. But just the fact that they're not their whole life does not revolve around this one particular exam, or their self-worth is not tied to whether they are failing or being successful in this exam, that is what makes them they're easily able to deal with the failures and they're able to overcome them, right? On the other hand, there might be some people who might have seen multiple failures in the in in previous attempts, but they're very they're still kind of balanced, and they still have that self confidence that that I've done everything right, and I've I have everything that I need within me to be able to clear this exam. And even if whether I clear it or not, that does not that does not make a lot of difference in my life in terms of uh, it does not change anything about me as a person. While my life might change after the exam, or it might change after clearing the exam, but my perception of me will not change irrespective. So when we are in that kind of a condition, it becomes much more easier for us to cope with multiple failures, to cope with everything around us. Right? Now let's come to how fear of failure actually manifests in our life. So I'll write FOF for fear of failure. I hope that is fine. Now another surprising or interesting phenomena that happens when it comes to fear of failure is that it can either represent or manifest itself as chronic procrastination, which most of us are easily able to recognize. That if we are if we are chronically procrastinating our things, it is probably because we are avoiding failures in our lives, right? But there's another manifestation, which is overworking. There are some people, because of their fear of failure, they have a tendency to overwork themselves. And whether you choose chronic procrastination or overworking, so while this choice of procrastination versus overworking is not something we consciously choose, it is more of a more of an unconscious decision that we kind of indulge in. But whichever pathway that we are on, whether we are chronically procrastinating or we are overworking ourselves, both of them have a self-fulfilling tendency. Why? So if we are procrastinating, That means I'm not studying enough. If I'm not studying enough, I'll not get good marks. If I don't get good marks, I'll naturally not clear the exam, which means my fear of failure actually came true, right? So it becomes a self-fulfilling tendency that because I started with the fear of failure, which caused procrastination, because of which I was not able to clear the exam, and then failure happened, and then that thing happened. I was right about it. I knew I would fail. Similarly, even if we are choosing overworking, while I might temporarily do good, let's say in the mocks, or even if I have let's say I gave the prelims, I did really good, I cleared the prelims, but there will come a point when I'll suddenly crash, right? So if we have overworking, there will naturally come a point when we'll suddenly crash, where we feel I don't know what happened, I just feel out of nowhere I feel burnt out, I feel exhausted, I feel like I could not continue. And God forbid if it happens right before your any exam, right before your prelims, or right before your mains, or right before your interview. What happens? Because I am suddenly crashed, I'm despite everything, despite the best of my efforts, I'm not able to continue my studies. So first thing is anxiety would set in, that my exam is so near but I'm not able to study. Plus, because I am there might be certain things which I should have studied but I am not studying, that would lead to uh, let's say mismanaged preparation. And in both these cases, there's a chance that I'll not clear the exam. And if I don't clear the exam, my fear of failure is proved right. So you see, whichever way you choose, whether you choose a procrastination way or you choose an overworking way, if there's a fear of failure, it has a self-fulfilling tendency, and it will naturally bring you to a point where ultimately what you experience is a failure. And so the initial assumption that we started with, the initial expectation that we had, that I'll fail, that kind of gets established, right? Just here, when we talked about this expectation or the assumption that I'm going to fail, this kind of gets verified. And so for the next attempt, this fear of failure gets even more strengthened. Why? Because last time when I had this fear, it actually happened, which means this time it will also happen. So now my fear is 2 times what it was earlier, right? It does happen. Even if I talk about myself, in my first mains, this had happened with me also. I had exhausted myself after my prelims. Like I was done with studies, and in 1 month when actually the exam, the results had come, I was just in no position to study anymore. I was so exhausted that I just could not pick myself up. And that year we only had 2 months to prepare for mains, and 1 month had already gone by till the time the results were out. So we had only 1 month between the result declaration and the mains exam. So that year, I knew before going into the exam that this is going to end in a disaster, which also happened. But yeah, it generally happens that we overwork, and then we suddenly feel a crash, and that crash, it leads to mismatch. Are you saying something? Okay.
कोई जाएंगे
If you're saying, either mute yourself, or if you're saying something, you can probably type in the chat box because it is becoming noisy and I'm not able to understand. Okay. So now let's see what causes this fear of failure. Okay. So while we have already talked about this expectation and this assumption and internalization of fear, but let's also see what are the other causes which leads to fear of failure. First is there's certain societal expectations from all of us, right? We all are social creatures. As social creatures and as part of a society, there's always a certain expectation that people around us have from us, and these are age related expectations, right? So if you're let's say if you're a school going child, there would be certain one kind of expectation. If you are somebody who has just graduated, there would be another kind of expectation. If you are, let's say, approaching your 30s, probably your parents would be forcing you for marriage. If you're above 30, then your parents are definitely forcing you for marriage if you're not married. If you're above 35, your parents would have probably thought, yep, jane do, like this case is gone, or so on. Every things might differ from one person to another, but there are certain still certain age expectations that most of us experience, right? So while this again, so while I want to make this clear, so while there's this component of societal expectations that are there, not everyone will take the same pressure, right? Right. So while these social expectations cause a certain pressure on us, but not everybody would experience that same societal expectation causing the same kind of pressure. There might be one person who would experience the same expectation, but they would not be bothered by it, while there would be some other who would be very, very concerned about not meeting these expectations, right? So there are personal factors also which kind of mediate between the external environment and what we are actually experiencing, right? The second thing is anticipated embarrassment. So just as I mentioned, the failure in itself is not a problem. It is not as much of a threat. But because I fear that I will have to face ridicule, I'll have to face embarrassment. Like what will people say syndrome. So because I have to experience this, and because I'm scared of experiencing this, what will people say? What will my padosi say? What will my friends say? What will my XYZ person say? So because we are concerned about the embarrassment that might follow that might come up with a failure, that is what causes fear of failure, right? What we are so in that case, what we are actually scared of is not failure itself, but the embarrassment, right? So if you're working, if that is the case with you, so what for you the core issue that you need to deal with is this embarrassment and not the failure itself, right? And that is why knowing what is your cause of fear of failure becomes important, so that you can know what your root cause is and you can address that cause rather than uh, just going going on the surface level issues, right? The third reason why this could happen is perfectionism. Some of us have perfectionist kind of a tendency that I need to be in the best school, I need to be in the best college, I need to if I'm cracking the if I'm giving this exam, I need to crack the exam in the first attempt itself. And I not only in the first attempt, but I also want to be in the top 10 ranks. And why only top 10 rank? I want to be the first ranker, and I want to clear the exam in the first attempt itself. So there are so many so many expectations and so many perfections that we want for ourselves, that we unnecessarily create a lot of anxiety and a lot of unrequired pressure on us. And most of the toppers, if you talk to them, most of the toppers who actually had AIR 1 in their in their result, if you ask them if they actually aimed at that, or if they were actually preparing with that conception that they only want all India rank 1, most of them will tell no. So if you operate from a point where you where you really after that I only want all India rank 1, you will do much more mistakes, many more mistakes than somebody who's going with a free mind and who's going with who just wants to do their best rather than aiming for कि नहीं मुझे फर्स्ट रैंक ही चाहिए, मुझे फर्स्ट अटेम्प्ट में ही निकालना है, या so on and so forth. And I'll tell you why this happened. So let's assume that there are two people who have cleared prelims, right? Both of them have to write mains. Now the person who's after getting rank 1, अब उनका क्या है कि now if they're preparing any subject, for them they would want कि I need to ensure that any question the examiner asks, I need to know, and it's not enough for me to know, I also need to have the best answer for it. Which means that any subject that I'm picking up, I'll take more time in that. I'll probably try to prepare all the peripheral topics in that particular subject, which means towards the end I'll realize that I'll not be able to complete the syllabus. Which means that when I actually give the exam, I realize I'm only prepared for half the for half the questions. For the second half, I'm not prepared because I was so busy perfecting the other subjects that I did not have the time to go over the entire syllabus, and I'm compromising on my overall answer sheet. Right? On the other hand, the other person who just wanted to do their best and who was not concerned about I need to crack in the first attempt, I need to I need to get all India rank 1, I need to be in top 10 and so on and so forth. That person would only focus on, okay, what is it that I need to do right now? This is the syllabus, this is the test that I need to aim, this is the next test that I'm writing. I'll try to manage to get at least good marks in this test. I'll see what my mistakes are. I'll improve upon that. I'll pick up the next topics for the next test. I'll do that. I'll move on. Right. So they have a much more likelihood of having a more balanced preparation. And that is why perfectionism is is the enemy, is your enemy in UPSC exam. If you if you actually aim to get all India rank 1, you shouldn't be perfectionist, you shouldn't be perfectionist in the first place. If you're someone who's aiming for rank 1 and you're also a perfectionist, then only God can help you by giving you only by giving you that wisdom that you need to stop at that point of time and that you're prepared enough. If you have that wisdom within you at when you're preparing, then you're lucky, then you're you have everything, you're good to go. But most of us are not, and most of us have that expectation within us कि फर्स्ट अटेम्प्ट में निकालना है, या फिर जब भी मेंस लिख रहे हो तो इसी अटेम्प्ट में मतलब ऑल इंडिया रैंक 1 वाली ही प्रेपरेशन करके जाएंगे, वरना मेंस ही नहीं लिखेंगे जाके, या जो भी देयर आर वेरी high expectations that we have for ourselves. While having expectations of ourselves is not bad in per se, but again if you're totally if your entire self-worth is based on whether you're successful or not successful, that will have an impact on your performance, right? So the next is, so I'll write both of them here, perfectionism or high personal expectations. I put a lot of pressure on myself that I have to clear it in the first attempt, and that too college के साथ ऐसे हरी था, सब हाथ से निकल गया. Very common. I also had a client that I was working with, a UPSC client, and the same thing I experienced with him. कि नहीं मैम मुझे तो फर्स्ट अटेम्प्ट में ही निकालना है और पढ़ाई हो नहीं रही है. सो फिर भगवान जी भी आपको क्वेश्चन पेपर आके दे देंगे, तब भी अगर आपने पढ़ाई नहीं करी तो आप उस क्वेश्चन पेपर का भी क्या करोगे. बट ठीक है. ठीक है. So sometimes what also happens is For some of us, this might apply. For some of us, this might not apply. That sometimes when we have when we have had a critical upbringing as a child, it also has an impact on fear of failure. So if as a child I know that any time that I've not done well, I've not fulfilled my parents' expectations, that has led to negative repercussions for me. Like, I get a lot of scolding, or anytime that I'm not able to do well, I do not get good marks in my school. I get thrashed at my home, or anything. Like, if I've had a very, very critical parenting, like I've received very, very critical parenting, that might have an impact on me developing a fear of failure. Because now if I'm not doing good, it has a very, very negative connotation in my mind. So that might also be the case for some of you. For not it's not something that is applicable to everyone who has a fear of failure, but for some of you it might be the case. Similarly, there could be certain negative past events, past experiences that might be associated. So let's say, even though my parents were very understanding and very compassionate, let's say, I was working on a very crucial project in school, or let's say I was in a, I was in some inter school competition or something, and because of something my team could not do well, and my principal really thrashed out on me. And that kind of, I have a very bad memory associated with that event. So now from that moment onwards, I've kind of developed that fear, what if things go wrong because of me and I get scolded? Right? So any kind of negative past experience might be there, which can create this fear of failure. And then there's also the cultural notions around failure. So here, if I talk about cultural notions about failure, so different societies have different notions regarding, success and failure. For us in India, most of us, what we experience is that as Indians, we prefer to have to experience safety rather than risk taking, right? As a society, we always prefer कि आप job ले लो, job is a better idea than doing a, rather than doing a business, or taking risk is not something which is very desirable, right? So anytime that we are doing something which involves a certain amount of risk, this thought, what will people say if I fail, that kind of gets exaggerated. Why? Because as a culture, we really, we see failure as something which is really, something not good. While on the other hand, there are other cultures where failure is not seen as something so drastically bad and such a, such a big event or something. For a lot of other societies, failure is just a part of the experience of, okay, it happens. Sometimes we lose, sometimes we win. So there's this cultural notion also. But again, as I said earlier, the societal expectations or the cultural notions, while they do have an impact, but the person who is experiencing fear of failure, it will depend on them. How much would they allow the societal expectations or the cultural notions to dictate their own life, right? So that still stays. While I'm acknowledging that yes, these factors do play a role, but again, the internal factors do have a much more important role to play, right? Now let's come to how to deal with it. Enough of gyan on what is fear of failure and what causes it and everything. Now let's come to the main mudda that we were here for. How do we deal with it, right? So first is reframe failure. What does that mean? It means that from now on, I will see failure as a normal part of human experience, right? So as I mentioned earlier, uh, where did I mention it? Yeah. So if I'm saying that failure means I'm unworthy, it will obviously lead to fear of failure. But if I'm telling myself that failure is just another experience, then there's less likelihood of experiencing fear of failure. In fact, why do we even have to call failure as something like, why do we have to call, okay, you failed the exam? We can simply say that you did not qualify for the exam, right? We can simply say that, this attempt was not successful. And that is much more empowering for us rather than admitting, okay, I failed in the exam. I failed versus I was not a success, I was not successful in this attempt. The second one sounds much more empowering and much more something which still gives us hope, right? So instead of failure, switch to the word unsuccessful or not qualified, right? Secondly, so if failure was something that was a day-to-day event, I wouldn't really be bothered about it, right? So let's say, uh, let's say if you're living in an environment which is very, very cold, right? So now if you are shifted to another place which also experiences a cold weather, would you be really bothered about that cold? No, right? Why? Because you have already experienced cold enough, or like enough number of times, and you have developed the resources to cope with that. So what does that mean for us? Does that mean we need to fail in everything that we do? No. But what we need to do is we need to experience those things where we expect to fail on a more regular basis, which means that let's say if I'm feared, like if I have this fear that I'll only give the exam when I'm fully prepared, otherwise I'll not give the exam, right? If this is the thing that bothers me, so ultimately what happens that let's say I had enrolled in a test series, I gave the first test, I saw, okay, I'm not scoring well. So before the next test, what will I tell myself? I'm not prepared enough, I'll give the second test only when I'm fully prepared. I extend that preparation. I realize that now it is the time for the third test, but I'm still not fully prepared for the third test also. So I skip that test as well. I give the second test, but now the time for the fourth test has come, and I'm my third test was still left. Now I'm not able to manage my fourth test also. Both of them become a backlog, and so on and so forth. And I directly go and give the exam in the in the final prelims paper, and then I flunk because that fear because uh, I kept avoiding experiencing failure in that areas where the stakes were not as high. So I ultimately had to experience a failure where the stakes were actually high, right? But on the other hand, if we get accustomed to this thinking, I really need to sit and give the exam, sit and write the test, irrespective of whatever marks I'm getting. I do not mind getting a zero also in the, although it's really not possible to get a zero in a, in an exam like prelims or a type of level of exam. But let's say, even if we take that scenario, that I'm okay with getting a really bad score also, right? So if I'm experiencing that again and again, this failure of actually sitting in an exam in itself becomes something bearable. A lot of people have anxiety while they're sitting in the exam and while they have not received that paper. Why? Because they're continuously thinking, what happens if I fail? What happens if I fail? But if I've already have had experiences of sitting in an exam and writing a test paper. So now I know, it's okay. I've already experienced this thing. It's not something that is as scary or as, something which is so horrendous for me. I can deal with that, right? Now there might be some of you who would be in your advanced, advanced attempts, and for you, a lot of for a lot of people who are in their advanced attempts, they do not prefer uh, attempting test series, and they do not write a lot of tests as such. And while that is fine, everybody has their own strategies. If you're one of them, I would still suggest that even if you're not sitting for a test series per se, but do consider writing those tests at your own home. Self evaluate yourself, whatever you're doing, ask a friend to evaluate you, whatever. But overcome that thing that, unless and until I'm fully prepared, I'll not sit for the test. Avoid that tendency. Allow yourself to get bad marks. Allow yourself to experience, okay, allow yourself to experience that discomfort of not getting very well, or like of not doing well. Why will that help? Because first of all, if I'm continuously giving tests, I'm in that zone of where I know what kind of preparation I need to do. What are the things which are being continuously asked in the exams, where I need to focus on, and what are the things that I can probably put less effort towards. And also, if you're writing tests multiple number of times, you also kind of get into the habit of in terms of mains, if you're writing a number of tests, you get in that habit of writing good answers eventually. If not good answers, at least decent answers. But if you're not writing any answers, then God only knows what you'll write in the exam, in the actual exam. Right? So allow failure to happen on a day-to-day life so that it can become normalized, so that you can know what are the potential mistakes you'll do, and you can work upon them and you can improve. Right? Don't be afraid of the day-to-day failures. The third thing is desired future. So most of us, when we think about what is the outcome that we are aiming towards, let's say some of us say, I want to become IPS officer. Some of us might say, I want to become IFS. I want to become IAS. Right? So most of us have some or the other choice and preference. So while a lot of people will end right there, this is what I want. But what I want you to do is go a little steps ahead and see, what are the changes in my life that I'm anticipating as a result of actually cracking the exam and becoming whatever I want to become, and see what is the kind of life that I'm aiming towards, and seek that lifestyle and that those and seek that future instead of the particular outcome that I can only be happy only and only if I get this particular service. Right? So if I seek that lifestyle, I have many more options in order to be happier and in order to be at ease with life. Rather than if I'm only fixated on one thing, that only and only if I get this, I'll be happy. But if I'm not getting this, and if I'm getting something which is similarly placed but not the exactly same as what I wanted, then I'm not going to be happy. I'll always be at war with life, isn't it? Right? So what I want you guys to do is that I want you to sit with yourself and and really question yourself, what will I get if I do become an officer? What is the kind of life that I really want to live? And aim towards that life rather than just this particular outcome. So desired future versus outcome. Aim for the future rather than the outcome. That again, what it does is it kind of depressurizes you from that expectation that only and only if I get this, I can be I'll be called successful. If I'm and even if I'm getting something which is as good as this but not the same as this, then I'm not successful. So that that all those extra pressures that we add on ourselves, all of those will be reduced to a lot of extent. Then just like we talked about making failure a day-to-day event, similarly make small wins a day-to-day event. What does that mean? So because UPSC is a very long game, it's not like it's one exam that you give once in a while and then it's done and dusted with. It becomes a very, very long game. You have prelims and mains and interviews. God forbid if you do not clear, then you have another cycle that you need to sit through. And it takes a couple of years, right? And for people who have experienced multiple failures at this exam, for them it, this fear of failure can really become very intense. So for them it becomes very, very necessary that they do have small wins every now and then. And how can they have those small wins? First is, of course, let's say you're taking a test series and you're doing good in that test series. That could be one way. Or you're fulfilling your daily targets. That could be another way. What could be other ways? Even things that are outside your studies. And I would actually emphasize on doing on focusing on certain things which are outside your studies and where you can get some quick gains there. Let's say you have some fitness targets, right? So on the time, at times when exam is not on your head, probably in those times it might be a good idea to have certain other life goals and work towards those and make make progress on that, right? So for a lot of us, mains have just ended. So in case, this might be a good time for a lot of people to start focusing on their health. Long continuous hours of sitting really puts us in a bad situation physically. So for a lot of us, it might be a good idea that we start working out, that we take care of our diet and so on and so forth. And if we are able to achieve some of our fitness targets, that kind of reinforces our self-esteem. It builds up our confidence in ourselves. And those small wins, when they accumulate over time, they have a huge impact on our self-esteem and our self-worth. Then this equation that failure means that I'm not worthy does not matter, because I've already experienced small wins throughout my throughout the past 1 year, right? So it becomes very, very important that you integrate small moments of wins every now and then. So it could be a relationship win, it could be a fitness win, it could be even, let's say, monetary win. So let's say, I'm somebody who likes to save. So if I'm saving, right now I'm saving 5,000 a month. If and now I get a monthly allowance of, let's say, XYZ amount, and I'm only saving, I've been saving 5,000 a month. Now let me keep a target for 8,000 a month, and I'm able to save that 8,000. That means I had a win, right? Another win could potentially be that I have developed a habit of eating ice cream every night. So from now on, I'll have ice cream only once a week. If I'm able to achieve that, it becomes a win for me, right? So those small wins, while it may look very inconsequential in terms of failing in an exam which is deciding our career, while it may look very inconsequential, but when you add up those small wins throughout your 1 year of duration, it actually has a much more positive impact on your self-esteem. Uh, when you have those small wins versus somebody who doesn't have those small wins and is directly experiencing a failure, right? So that is there. And then finally, working on the core issue. So you can ask yourself, why is it that I'm failing? I'm fearing this failure. What is it that is causing me to fear this failure? Is it the societal expectation? Is it some past experience that I've not been able to overcome? Is it my perfectionist tendencies? Do I have extremely high expectations of myself? Am I putting a lot of pressure on myself? Evaluate yourself and see what you can do to overcome those core issues. In case you need a if there's a case of a past trauma, in case of a any past negative experience or critical upbringing or something, in that case it might be a good idea to visit a therapist. But for most of the cases, for cases anticipated embarrassment, why do I fear, why am I so bothered about what will people say? These are the certain things that we can ask ourselves, and we can come to a conclusion. Okay, what can I do to improve upon that, right? So this is from my end as to what are the steps of overcoming fear of failure. Now, if you guys have any questions, you can go ahead and ask me. I'm done with the thing that I wanted to present. Now, if anyone of you have any questions, you can go ahead and ask me. If no, then I'll close the meeting then. Thank you so much, Rajput, for attending the session. Okay. Thank you all of you for attending the session, and a good night to all of you. No problem. Do let me know which topic would you like me to cover in the upcoming webinars. The next one that I'm planning is I'm planning the next session on loneliness, because I've got a lot of uh, DMs where people are concerned about loneliness. So that is the next topic that I'm planning to do. If you have any other recommendations, you can let me know.
Hello.
Mm-hmm.
Ma'am, you talked about the perfectionism kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
मैम अभी जो मेंस दिया अभी जो 2024 वाला उसके
Mm-hmm.
अंदर आई हैड एन इशू मैम ऐसा कभी नहीं था कि रैंक वन लानी है टॉप 10 में लाना है ऐसा कुछ नहीं था आई जस्ट वांटेड अ सिलेक्शन कि हाँ रैंक आ जाए कोई सी भी आ जाए कोई फर्क नहीं पड़ता बट स्टिल देयर वाज दिस थिंग कि एक क्वेश्चन कि हाँ यहाँ से हर टॉपिक का आपने जैसे बताया कि बात करी कि पेरिफेरल टॉपिक सारे होने चाहिए कि यहाँ से हर उस टॉपिक पे मुझे सब कुछ आना चाहिए मैं एक आंसर भी मेरे आंसर सबसे अच्छे हो ये चीज़ के यहाँ से काफ़ी मतलब था इशू इशू था उसकी वजह से कोर्स कंप्लीट नहीं हो पाया काफ़ी दिक्कत हुई यहाँ से एंड आई डोंट नो कि यहाँ से कि वो चीज़ क्यों हुई तो आई वांटेड टू टॉक अबाउट इट
Is that your first mains attempt?
यस मैम यस मैम
So that is a common challenge that most of the first, people who write for mains for the first time, most of them experience this. Because of course, we would ideally want to convert the first mains experience that we had. तो उसमें क्या होता है कि जस्ट बिकॉज आई वांट कि ये सारे टॉपिक जो भी मैं पढ़ रहा हूँ सब कुछ अच्छे होने चाहिए, उसकी वजह से आई बी in the first month whichever subject we had chosen, that goes on till the entire month, and then we realize कि अच्छा ये तो टाइम ही अब बहुत कम बचा है. So for me it happened with I think GS1 it was. I started with GS1 and I realized कि मेरे एक महीने निकालते सिर्फ GS1 करने में. So so that kind of happens. Like it does happen because especially if you do not have somebody who's guiding you and mentoring you, in that case it becomes even more exaggerated, where we do not know where to stop, right? So again, I always recommend people what they should ideally do is कि जो भी आप टॉपिक पढ़ रहे हो, let's say GS1 आपने पिक करा है, GS1 में let's say आप हिस्ट्री स्टार्ट कर रहे हो, first see what are the must have topics that I need to do. What are the basic things कि इसके बिना these are the core things that are there. Finish those core things, move to the next subject. वहां उसकी जो core things है आप उसको करो. Let's say आपने geography pick करी, next geography की core topics क्या है आपने वो उठाए. फिर उसके बाद आपने let's say society pick करी, society की जो core topics है आपने वो उठाए वो करे. Now there would be certain peripheral topics that are there in history, also peripheral topics in geography also. Now UPSC has gotten into that phase where it is asking so many peripheral things around geography. तो आप सब कुछ करने बैठ जाओगे तो फिर तो आप ज्योग्राफी ही करते रह जाओगे, फिर तो you do a PhD in geography rather, right? So instead of that, do the core things in every subject first. Once you're done with all the core things, उसके बाद decide करो कि अच्छा कौन से subject में कितना और focus करना है, right? And if you're writing certain tests, if you're giving certain tests, you'll also get an evaluation. So you'll also understand कि अच्छा even though I'm prepared with certain core topics, there are still some gaps that might be there. So focus on those gaps rather than कि नहीं नहीं मुझे तो एक एक topic cover करना चाहिए. Write more tests and that will give you that will give you much more insight into किस direction में preparation होनी चाहिए.
ओके मैम थैंक यू
All right.
या
Even this goes for interview people also. For a lot of people, they keep preparing for interview and वो mock में तभी बैठते हैं when they think कि अच्छा like कि मेरा first mock ही सबसे अच्छा होना चाहिए. अगर वो अच्छा नहीं हुआ तो फिर तो नहीं, मतलब ऐसे तो नहीं चलेगा. So I'll go and sit in the first mock only when it is very very close to the actual interview. And first mock में I realize कि oh shit, मैंने तो like मेरी preparation की direction इधर थी, मुझे जाना इधर था. And now I only have, let's say, 1 week or so to prepare, to redirect and like to correct my way. Then it becomes a problem. So again, like just as I said, ki make failure a day-to-day event. Don't run. Don't try to escape failure. Try to embrace challenging experiences. Ki theek hai, like let me give a mock even if I do like if I do major blunders there. It's okay. क्या होगा ज्यादा तो यही तो बोलेंगे कि भाई अच्छा तुम्हें नहीं आता सीख लो, तो सीख लेंगे, right? So, whether you are at prelims, write as many tests as you can, attempt questions, attempt PYQs. Whether you're writing mains, attempt test, attempt PYQs, write as many answers as you can. Whether you're in interview, give mocks. I'm not like so interview में वो रहता है कि there's a golden golden number of mock interviews that you should give. बहुत ज्यादा दोगे तो भी उसके नुकसान होते हैं, बट बहुत कम दोगे तो उसके तो रहते हैं, स्पेशली इफ यू गिव वेरी वेरी क्लोज टू द योर एक्चुअल इंटरव्यू, उसके तो नुकसान होते ही होते हैं. सो आइडियली एज सुन एज यू गेट टू नो कि अच्छा मेरी इंटरव्यू कॉल आ रही है, that is the within that week in itself you should you should aim for giving one mock, even if you are very very ill prepared. At least you will get to know कि अच्छा मुझे prepare किस direction में करना है, especially if it is your first interview, right? So that is there. um, don't escape failure, make it something which is more common and which is more something that you experience on a day to day level. तो वो उतना बड़ा फिर वो नहीं लगता कि हाँ ये फेल हो गए, वो चीज नहीं रह जाती फिर. ठीक है. You learn a lot of things from a failure, but for that you actually need to fail right before, much before you actually have something very high. वो जो हाई स्टेक सिचुएशन है उससे पहले आप कई बार फेल हो रहे हो तो आपको बहुत सारी चीजें सीखने को मिल जाएंगी. आप तब का वेट करोगे जब बहुत हाई स्टेक्स होंगे और तभी इकट्ठा फेल होंगे तो फिर becomes a problem then. Okay, any more questions? If no, then I'll close the session and then we can meet in the next. All right, I don't think there are any more questions. So thank you all of you for attending this session. I hope there was something that all of you could take away from this session. And the next session will most probably be on the topic of loneliness. And I'll also release the schedule of the upcoming webinars and other initiatives as well. So
Ma'am,
thank
will
you.
you share this document in the group?
I'll share the document
Okay.
in the group.
Okay. Thank you, ma'am. Thank
All
you.
right, thank you. Bye bye. Good night.